My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 73 years old, and if you had driven past my little brick house in Ashford Ridge a few years ago, you probably would have thought it was exactly what everyone else assumed I was. Just another quiet widow tending her roses, waving at neighbors from the porch, and living out the rest of her days in peace. The funny thing about assumptions is that they're usually made by people who never bother asking questions, and that's exactly how this whole nightmare started. The morning everything changed looked perfectly ordinary. I walked out to my mailbox with a cup of coffee in one hand and a bag of birdseed in the other because the Cardinals always showed up around 8, and after losing my husband Frank to cancer 3 years earlier, feeding those birds had somehow become part of my morning routine. Almost like they were checking in on me. Mixed between grocery coupons and church newsletters was a thick, certified envelope with the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association logo stamped across the front. I remember smiling for a second because I figured it was probably another reminder about the annual neighborhood picnic. Instead, I opened it right there by the mailbox, and before I reached the second paragraph, my coffee was shaking in my hand. According to the letter, I supposedly owed $3,100 in unpaid HOA dues, another $2,000 in penalties, attorney fees, administrative costs, and several other charges that somehow pushed the total above $11,000. Then came the sense that made my stomach drop. If payment was not received within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin against my property. My property. The same house Frank and I spent 36 years paying off. The same front porch where we watched our grandchildren chase fireflies every summer. The same kitchen where we celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and every Thanksgiving our family could squeeze around one table. I read that sentence at least 5 times because surely there had to be some mistake. There simply had to be. I have never missed a payment in my life. Not one mortgage payment. Not one property tax bill. Not one HOA assessment. Frank used to tease me that I could probably organize the IRS if they ever hired me because I kept every receipt, every canceled check, every bank statement inside labeled binders in the hallway closet. That habit came from my father, who always said memories fade, but paperwork doesn't. So before I panicked, I walked inside, pulled out the blue binder marked HOA, and started flipping through the pages. January, paid. February, paid. March, paid. Every quarterly assessment was there, complete with canceled checks and bank confirmations. I wasn't behind by a single dollar. At first, I honestly believed someone in the HOA office had entered a number wrong, so I called the management office expecting a simple apology. Instead, the receptionist transferred me directly to the HOA president, Melissa Harlan. I'd seen Melissa around the neighborhood plenty of times. She was in her early 50s, always dressed like she was running for city council, drove a brand new luxury SUV every other year, and somehow managed to make every community meeting about herself. The moment she answered, I politely explained that I'd received a foreclosure notice even though I had proof every payment had cleared my bank. She didn't even pretend to check the records. She laughed, actually laughed, then said, "Mrs. Carter, we've heard every excuse in the book. At your age, it's easy to forget things. Maybe someone should be helping you with your finances." I sat there holding the phone in complete silence for a second because I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned. Then she kept going. "If I were you, I'd spend less time arguing and more time figuring out where you're going to live in 30 days. I've been spoken to by governors, senators, billion-dollar developers, and lawyers who build more per hour than most people earned in a week, but I honestly can't remember anyone ever sounding so casually disrespectful." It wasn't just that she believed I owed the money. She had already decided I was confused because I was old, vulnerable because I lived alone, and too intimidated to fight back. After we hung up, I walked through my house without really knowing where I was going. I stopped in Frank's old workshop, where his tools still hung exactly the way he left them. 3 years later, I still couldn't bring myself to move a single wrench. On the shelf above his workbench sat a framed photograph from the day I retired. Frank had his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing while dozens of people applauded in the background. I picked up the picture, smiled for a moment, then looked at the small engraved plaque beneath it. Most people who visited my house never noticed it because I never talked about my career unless someone asked. I didn't need strangers knowing what I used to do. Retirement meant leaving titles behind and simply becoming Evelyn again. But as I stood there staring at that plaque, something inside me shifted. Melissa Harlan had mistaken quiet for weakness, kindness for helplessness, and age for incompetence. She had absolutely no idea that before I became the elderly widow she mocked over the telephone, I had spent 26 years serving on my state's highest court, writing opinions that shaped property law across the entire state, including several decisions limiting exactly the kind of HOA abuse now aimed at my own front door. I quietly placed the photograph back on the shelf, walked into my study, opened my desk drawer, and pulled out a leather notebook I hadn't touched since retirement. I smiled to myself and whispered, "Well, Melissa, I was hoping never to do this again." She thought she had found the easiest target in the neighborhood. What she had actually done was wake up the one person who knew exactly where every legal body could be buried. I hadn't opened that leather notebook in almost 4 years, and the smell of old paper brought back memories I honestly thought I had left behind forever. Retirement had been my reward after decades of deadlines, hearings, opinions, and endless stacks of legal briefs. I promised Frank that when I finally stepped away from the bench, we'd spend our mornings fishing, our afternoons traveling, and our evenings watching the sunset from our porch without another lawsuit invading our lives. Life, unfortunately, had different plans. Frank was gone, and now instead of planning my next gardening project, I was sitting at my dining room table building a legal strategy against the very people threatening to steal the house we'd built together. The first thing I did wasn't call an attorney. Old habits die hard. Before you ask anyone else to solve a problem, you gather every fact yourself. By lunchtime, my dining room looked less like a home and more like a law office. Bank statements were spread across one side of the table, canceled checks across another, HOA newsletters stacked in chronological order, and every annual budget report the association had ever mailed to homeowners sat neatly arranged beside my laptop. Most people don't realize this, but financial fraud rarely begins with one dramatic lie. It begins with little inconsistencies, numbers that don't quite match, signatures that appear rushed, dates that don't line up. You don't find corruption by looking for explosions. You find it by noticing whispers. The foreclosure letter itself bothered me immediately because something about it felt off. The formatting looked slightly different from previous HOA correspondence. The attorney listed on the notice wasn't the same law firm Crestwood Estates had used for years. Even the board authorization language sounded unusually vague. None of those things proved fraud by themselves, but together they made me curious. Curiosity has solved more cases than suspicion ever could. The next morning, I submitted a formal records request under the association bylaws, asking for financial statements, board meeting minutes covering the previous 4 years, voting records authorizing foreclosure actions, contracts with vendors, and copies of every delinquency notice sent to homeowners during that period. The management company acknowledged receiving my request but suddenly became very interested in delaying everything. First, they needed additional processing time. Then they claimed some records were archived. A week later, they said several files were temporarily unavailable because their accounting software had recently been updated. Every excuse sounded polished, rehearsed, almost too convenient. That's when I became certain there was something they desperately hoped no homeowner would ever examine. While waiting for the records, I made another phone call, this one to an old colleague named Daniel Pierce. Daniel had spent nearly 30 years as a forensic accountant investigating municipal fraud before retiring around the same time I did. We hadn't spoken in over a year, yet the moment he heard my voice, he laughed and said, "Judge Carter, please don't tell me you've gotten bored enough to start investigating people again." I laughed too, then explained everything. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Finally, he said, "Send me every document you've got. If they're trying to foreclose on someone who keeps records the way you always did, somebody's about to have a very bad month." 2 days later, Daniel was sitting in my dining room wearing reading glasses balanced halfway down his nose while quietly studying spreadsheets. Every so often, he'd circle a number without saying a word. I knew that habit well. Daniel never spoke until he was certain. Around dinner time, he leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question. "Have you noticed how many landscaping invoices are exactly $9,900? I hadn't. He pointed at 6 different payments made to the same contractor over 3 years. Every invoice stopped just below the amount requiring additional board approval under HOA policy. That alone could have been coincidence, except every payment occurred within days of another invoice from the same contractor for nearly identical work. Artificially splitting expenses. Classic accounting manipulation. We kept digging. The maintenance contractor listed on official reports had an address that turned out to be an empty office suite. Another vendor existed only on paper. Several reserve fund transfers disappeared without explanation, before quietly reappearing months later under different account descriptions. Then Daniel froze. "Evelyn, come look at this." 2 board meeting minutes approved major legal action against delinquent homeowners, including foreclosure authority. Both minutes carried signatures from board members whose names I recognized. There was only one problem. One of those board members had moved to Arizona almost 6 months before the meeting supposedly took place. Another had passed away 2 weeks before the document claimed she attended the meeting. I felt the same chill I used to feel whenever a witness accidentally exposed an entire conspiracy with one careless statement. Those meetings had never happened. Someone had manufactured official records after the fact. Once we realized that, everything unraveled quickly. Daniel compared financial reports against bank deposits while I compared meeting minutes against neighborhood newsletters and election notices. Dates contradicted each other. Attendance lists changed between copies. Motions appeared without corresponding agenda items. It was sloppy, not because the fraud was small, but because nobody expected homeowners to investigate deeply enough to notice. I filed subpoenas for bank records connected to the HOA operating account, then requested copies of every foreclosure initiated during Melissa Harlan's presidency. 12 files appeared, 12 families accused of unpaid assessments, 12 nearly identical patterns, inflated balances, questionable attorney fees, missing board authorization. The more I read, the angrier I became. This was never about collecting dues. It was about intimidation. Most people don't have the time, money, or confidence to fight an HOA. They see legal paperwork, panic, borrow money, empty retirement accounts, or simply pay whatever they're told to avoid losing their homes. Melissa understood that better than anyone. Fear had become her business model. I decided to visit several homeowners personally. The first was a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Ellis, who nearly cried when I introduced myself because she thought someone else had come to collect money. She showed me a folder stuffed with notices she'd never understood. Her late payment somehow grew from $400 to nearly $8,000 after unexplained legal fees. Another homeowner, Carlos Mendoza, admitted he refinanced his house just to satisfy an HOA debt he never believed he owed. A young couple told me they canceled their daughter's college savings after receiving foreclosure threats. Story after story sounded painfully familiar. Different families, different numbers, same tactics. By the end of the week, 11 homeowners agreed to provide sworn affidavits. 3 agreed to testify in court if necessary. One former board member finally confessed something that changed the entire case. She admitted Melissa often circulated meeting minutes days after meetings supposedly occurred, asking members to sign them without reading because the attorney already approved everything. Sometimes meetings listed in official records never happened at all. That statement alone transformed what looked like civil misconduct into potential criminal fraud. As evidence piled higher across my dining room table, Melissa seemed completely unaware of what was happening. In fact, she doubled down. Another certified letter arrived warning that foreclosure would proceed unless I surrendered the property voluntarily before the scheduled court date. Tucked inside was a settlement agreement requiring me to admit the debt in exchange for reducing the amount owed. I couldn't help smiling. She wasn't trying to collect money anymore. She was trying to eliminate evidence. Daniel looked over the proposal and quietly said, "She's scared. People only rush settlements when they know discovery is coming." He was right. Discovery would expose everything. I spent the following weekend organizing exhibits exactly the way I had expected lawyers to do. During my years on the bench, every canceled check received its own tab. Every forged signature sat beside verified handwriting samples. Every fraudulent board minute was paired with contradictory newsletters, emails, and witness statements. By Sunday evening, the evidence filled 3 large binders. Looking at them, I realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't preparing to defend my home anymore. That battle had already been won. What I was preparing to do was expose an entire system built on fear before another widow, another retired teacher, or another young family became its next victim. Monday morning arrived with clear blue skies as I parked outside the county courthouse carrying those binders myself. Melissa climbed the courthouse steps wearing an expensive cream-colored suit, laughing with her attorney as though this would be another routine foreclosure against another frightened senior citizen. She glanced at me only once, smirked, and whispered just loudly enough for me to hear, "You still have time to settle." I smiled politely, adjusted the binders under my arm, and answered, "So do you." Neither of us said another word as the courtroom doors opened, and neither of us could have imagined that within the next few minutes, a single question from the judge would change every life connected to Crestwood Estates forever. The courtroom felt different after Judge Donovan dismissed the foreclosure. It wasn't loud, and nobody applauded or celebrated, but you could almost feel the atmosphere shift. Melissa Harlan walked into that room expecting another routine hearing against another frightened homeowner. Instead, she found herself sitting at the center of a case that had grown far beyond me. Judge Donovan carefully looked over the final exhibits before speaking one more time. Mrs. Harlan, this court is deeply troubled by what has been presented today. The evidence suggests that this was not an isolated accounting mistake, but part of a broader pattern that deserves immediate investigation. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Melissa tried to speak, opening her mouth twice before any words came out. Your Honor, I relied on information provided by the management company. The judge calmly shook his head. Then that explanation can be provided to investigators. This court will not speculate. The record speaks for itself. Watching her confidence disappear wasn't satisfying in the way people might imagine. It was strangely quiet. I'd spent enough years in courtrooms to know that the moment someone realizes the truth has finally caught up with them is rarely dramatic. It's usually silent. Their shoulders drop. Their eyes stop searching for easy answers. Reality simply arrives all at once. Within days, investigators from the state attorney's office executed search warrants for HOA financial records, compounder and meter systems, and banking documents. Daniel called me almost every evening with another update. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. Payments had been redirected through shell vendors. Legal invoices had been inflated. Homeowners who questioned unusual fees were suddenly fined for unrelated violations. Entire foreclosure files had been assembled using forged authorizations that no legitimate board vote had ever approved. The investigators eventually uncovered nearly $75,000 in missing association funds spread across several years. Even more disturbing, they found internal emails discussing which homeowners were least likely to fight back. Elderly widows, disabled veterans, families struggling financially. They weren't chosen by accident. They were selected because Melissa believed fear would keep them quiet. That realization stayed with me longer than any dollar amount ever could. I wasn't the real target. I was simply the wrong person to target. Several months later, the criminal case concluded. Melissa entered guilty pleas to multiple felony charges involving fraud, forgery, theft of association funds, and filing false legal documents. She received a lengthy prison sentence, substantial restitution orders, and permanent restrictions preventing her from serving as an officer or director of any nonprofit association again. Her attorney requested leniency, arguing that community pressure and financial stress had influenced her decisions. The prosecutor answered with a sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Financial pressure explains bad decisions. It does not explain forging documents to steal people's homes. There wasn't much left to argue after that. My own civil lawsuit ended quietly a few weeks later. The court awarded compensation for the fraudulent foreclosure attempt, emotional distress, legal expenses, and punitive damages. Friends kept asking what I planned to do with the money. Honestly, I replaced the roof Frank and I had been putting off, donated part of the settlement to a legal aid organization that helps senior homeowners, and put the rest away. Peace has always been worth more to me than luxury. The biggest change happened inside our neighborhood. Crestwood Estates elected an entirely new board. Monthly financial reports became public. Every contract required competitive bidding. Homeowners were invited to inspect records without endless delays or excuses. Attendance at community meetings nearly tripled because people finally understood that paying attention isn't being difficult. It's being responsible. One Saturday afternoon, Margaret Ellis, the retired school teacher I met during my investigation, stopped by with a homemade apple pie. She hugged me longer than she probably realized and quietly said, "You didn't just save your house, you saved ours too." I don't mind admitting that I cried after she left. Not because I felt heroic, because I realized how close so many decent people had come to losing everything simply because they believed no one would listen. Every now and then someone still asks whether I regret coming out of retirement for one last legal fight. The answer is simple. I never came out of retirement to win a case. I came out because silence would have made me part of the problem. Melissa underestimated me because she saw an older woman living alone. She assumed age meant weakness, kindness meant ignorance, and quiet meant surrender. She never bothered asking who I was before retirement. Had she done that, she might have discovered that some careers never truly leave you. You may stop wearing the robe, but you never stop recognizing injustice when it walks through the front door. So now I'd like to ask you something. If someone tried to intimidate you with legal paperwork you knew was wrong, would you fight back, or would you pay just to make the problem disappear? And where do you think the line should be between an HOA protecting a neighborhood and an HOA abusing its authority? Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations matter more than ever. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more real-world stories about ordinary people standing up to extraordinary abuse of power. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and never underestimate the quiet neighbor who keeps every receipt.